Now, one of the most notable things was the comparison between how propaganda appears to everybody else and how the propaganda appears to people within North Korea. And I think that alone should disabuse people of a lot of thoughts about North Korea. Kim Jong-il fancied himself a filmmaker.
Yes.
And was that material useful at all?
Well, I purchased his book, but everything that's apparently been written by any of the Kim family members reads like a graduate school dissertation that was written 2 hours before it was due and you had 10 pages left. So it's a lot of repetitious, multisyllabic words that actually have no content of themselves. It's incredibly repetitious, and it feels like you're just trying to get right to book length, don't even copy check it, and just set it out to the masses. So there's a book called, I think it's Kim Il-sung's Thoughts on the Arts of Cinema or something like that. And I would say the one quick thing, and I am obviously more than happy to pontificate about this point in particular if asked, that idea of trying to normalize how the propaganda works there is supposed to cut against, particularly now, a lot of the way this country is portrayed, particularly the average North Koreans, where I've noticed a shocking amount of just like brazen condescension for these people. I mean, you can make fun of the leader as much as you want, he deserves it, but the average person who's born there, this is just the world that they grew up in. And I think that we flatter ourselves when we think that we wouldn't do likewise if born into that environment. And more importantly, there is absolutely shared genetic material between very acute forms of ideological control in North Korea and pernicious political and religious rhetoric here at home. That if you consider yourself a libertarian, you can look around in our society and you'll notice that people are uncomfortably willing to give up certain freedoms if they think it's part of some grander story, right? I mean, it's in no way to morally parallel the two, but there's a lot of people that if you tell them the right narrative, if you fit their choices within the right thing, they'll give up autonomous thought and they'll vote for that guy, or they'll support X, Y, or Z self-made guru. And that ultimately, I think, is what I'm attempting to combat in the film.
Doug, let me ask you one question, and then we'll open it up to everybody here. How many times can North Korea essentially defy expectations before the narrative about North Korea changes?
Well, these systems have enormous resiliency. It's not just the North Korean example. One can think of Cuba, one can think of others. I mean, there are studies that came out of Washington think tanks after the Soviet collapse predicting that Cuba was going to collapse within 6 months, and it's been 20 years. I mean, the same thing on North Korea. I've respected friends who are thoughtful, they know the country, and they've predicted North Korea's imminent collapse. It has not collapsed. And I think there are multiple things going on. Part of it is the fact that there is a narrative there that's very powerful. I mean, I visited there, it's been 20 years, but this stuff is pervasive. I mean, everywhere you go are photos of the leaders. Everywhere you go, I mean, on the streets, it's slogans over the streets, slogans in the fields, pictures on the buildings. I went running then. I was a marathon runner, so I ran every day in Pyongyang, took a different route. And early in the morning, you could look in windows of ground-level apartments and you'd see pictures of the leaders in the apartments. What I found at that point, clearly they were preparing the transition. There was kind of the 1950s photo of the great leader Kim Il-sung. There was kind of the 1970s vintage photo of Kim Jong-il, who was going to be taking over. And then there was a much more recent one showing the two conferring together. And I mean, this has got to be almost everywhere you went, the three photos were there, and it clearly is showing the great leader preparing to pass on his legacy to the dear leader. So this is imprinted. And it is a very thuggish place. I mean, it's a very class-oriented place. There are multiple categories. You're basically, your family is, they decide what your family is. You are ally or enemy. Pyongyang is for the nomenclature, for the elite. If you're viewed as an enemy, you're out in the countryside. They will punish up to 3 generations. If there is a transgression within the family, you, your parents, and your kids go off to the labor camp. I mean, it's very powerful, very limiting in terms of resistance. And it's a system where if you essentially keep the 2 or 3 million people in Pyongyang and 1 million members of the military well-fed, it's very hard for 20 million peasants to organize. So you put together, I think, the narrative plus a totalitarian structure. I wouldn't bet that this place is going to fall apart anytime soon. It's gone under enormous stress over the last 20 years. 500,000 people or more died of starvation, we think, in the 1990s, and it survived. So we should not assume, I wouldn't be betting. Eventually, I think it will go away, but how soon, who knows?
I was wondering if I could get the panel to respond to what they know of the impact of smuggled-in media is having on the North Korean populace. I mean, I hear that South Korean soap operas are hugely popular, and these soap operas depict a very wealthy South Korea where the people live a good life. And the fact that you hear that these things are so popular, it just wonders how is that meshing with the propaganda that they're getting, and what are we hearing from defectors on that?
So I have just two quick responses. I mean, the evidence, we know that there must be stuff coming into the country because the propaganda apparatus, particularly over the last 10 years, has changed and adopted. Because there was a certain point in time in which they plausibly could have claimed that South Korea was just an economic wreck, but at a certain point enough people knew that that wasn't the case. So now it's much more focused on the racial purity thing and the notion that South Koreans are ashamed that they've fallen under the Yankee yoke and that they might have material goods, but they crave like the pure ethnic society that North Korea has been able to craft. The second thing I would say is I think that we sometimes underestimate how much outside information the people that have at the upper echelons of the country get access to. They actually get quite a bit. Mrs. Ma, who's in this film, was kind of a mid-tier person in that apparatus, and she regularly traveled to China and had access to outside media. And I would say that it's instructive that we've had very, very few high-ranking defections in the country, despite the fact, particularly over the last 20 years, they've had increasing amounts of information about the outside world. And I do think that part of that, there's multiple reasons why that would be the case, but part of that has to be that if you craft a worldview for someone that they wrap their entire identity up into, you'd be shocked by what sort of facts that they can fit into that worldview, even if it seems from our perspective that there's no way those two things can be can coincide with each other. So yeah, I'd say that.
I do think that this is where it's important that they have both this kind of propaganda worldview plus a totalitarian apparatus. If you're high level and you defect, your family's dead. Your family's going to be in a labor camp. So it's clearly a system where there's a high price to be paid.
Right.
The system is very much under stress. There's no doubt about that. I mean, there's always been contact across the Yalu. The provinces across the Yalu have a lot of ethnic Koreans. I mean, there's families and there's a lot of connections. And unless you have guards shooting at people, it's relatively easy to get across. I visited the city of Dandong, which is the Chinese city on the border, a lot of trade across. And it's phenomenal, as you know, I mean, Dandong is a modern city. You look across into North Korea and it's nothing. And I went with a Chinese student who said, who lived there, he grew up there, he's in college. And he said, over the last 10 years, the growth on our side is extraordinary, and I look across and nothing's changed. And the North Koreans can see that. And there's been a lot more contact across. For a time, especially with the famine, the regime in certain ways lost control. The food distribution system wasn't working. Hundreds of thousands of refugees, the Chinese send them back to a very ugly fate. But there's been a lot of traffic back and forth. There are more cell phones now in North Korea. Now, you're not supposed to make international calls, but depending upon the risks you're willing to take, everyone has TVs and radios. They're preset. I mean, when I visited, I'd play with the radio and it would go chirp, 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 Kim Il-sung, chirp, 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 Kim Jong-il, chirp, chirp, chirp. But you could change that. Again, you're punished if you do that. But they're clearly, these have circulated in the black market. So there's a greater knowledge of what's out there, and it has put the regime under stress because there's clearly more knowledge getting in. To some degree, what you find is a lot of people realize they're being told lies, but they don't quite know what the truth is. So it's harder for the regime. They've been trying to clamp down under Kim Jong-un. They've made it tougher along the Yalu to try to prevent people from getting across. But I do think this is one of the hopes undermining the regime, is that you can put out the narrative, but at some point you know enough to know that that narrative isn't working, and slowly the totalitarian system breaks down. But it's a very tough system.
Yeah, just quickly on that point, I think it has to come from the ground up, and the thing that they've seen in a lot of the refugee accounts is, it's funny, so many of them have specifically said the real point where things snapped into place about the alternate reality that they'd been born into is when they go to China and they see that the dogs eat rice. Because rice is, it's very rare in North Korea. That multiple refugees have talked about that specific moment. They're like, wait a minute here. They're eating this, the dog is eating this luxury good. Something is really not right.